How am I ever going to sleep again? What was I thinking going to this movie by myself? Oh, right, I mistakenly thought I was an adult. Whew. So how did it shape up compared to everything else? It was awesome. Let's get into it. Welcome to the heart of the stories we tell. My name is Rob, and tonight I will be reviewing Stephen King's It. Chapter 1, I guess? And if you have no idea what this movie is, what rock have you been living under? Alright, there's a lot to unpack. It's based on a Stephen King novel that I got more or less tricked into reading by my older sister when I was a kid, and a miniseries was made for it starring Tim Curry as the main villain, the clown, It. At best, the miniseries gets a silver rating, although it did dodge one of the worst moments of the book, in my opinion. Something that's really problematic I don't know if we're even going to talk about. But this gets a gold. A solid gold. Now you can tell they put a lot of work into this. Right down to timing the release date so that it's 27 years later. I'm sure that if it had been, only 12, they wouldn't have waited another 15, but seriously, they put effort into this. And if you're just looking for a crazy-ass clown and a scary-ass movie, this is it. This is a scary-ass clown movie. But at the same time, it's not just a scary-ass clown movie. There's a lot really deep in here, and a lot of it goes back to the way Stephen King wrote the book, and some of it is just the way the director saw this. But you know what? It's been staring us right in the face the whole time. Let me show you what I mean. They weren't subtle with this theme, nor did they hide the symbolism. In fact, it was right in one of the first trailers.
When you're a kid, you think the universe revolves around you. You think that you'll always be protected and cared for. Then, one day, you realize that's not true.
In the past, we've talked about all sorts of types of stories. In fact, we went through exactly how many types of stories there really are, and that there aren't that many. You know what this is? This is a subset. Specifically, it's a psychological study, and it was in the book too, not so much in the miniseries, although they touched on it. It's a subgenre known as coming of age. And even though this is only the first part of the story, I think they do it pretty well. In fact, some of the stories are actually pretty damn adult. So, before we go any farther, I'm going to ask you to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, because we're going to handle a lot more about this sort of thing. But then we're going to get into specifics. So once again, it's stop. Spoiler time. So last warning, turn back now. I'm just glad that I get to save this warning until the absolute end when we talk about theme and symbolism and the good, the bad, and the ugly. For the most part, this isn't really a movie about killer clowns, like I said. This is a movie that has so much deep... Like, Stephen King wrote the book to be in your head and to try to really get into the heart of what it means to be a kid. And I'll tell you right now, some of the scenes could have been ripped right out of my own horror mind as a teenager. Now, the story itself, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go and do some elements of fiction. And we'll start with the setting. Physically, the movie takes place in Derry, Maine. And, well, most of Stephen King's movies take place in Maine. But specifically in this case, it takes place in the late 1980s. Now, I would have been 9 years old the summer of '89. Well, 8 years old, about to be 9. I would have been 9 at the end of the movie. At the end of the day, though, that time period involves a lot of what's going on. And I have to say, that New Kids on the Block stuff really brought me back to the 80s. And I wonder how much of that is necessary, really. I mean, could this story be told in 2017 is one of those things that I need to really think about with the way the internet does spooky pasta and stuff. I mean, the stories from Derry would have gotten out. Maybe not necessarily. But there's also another thing. See that turtle he dropped there? That's a big Easter egg for part of the fact that this is part of Stephen King's whole universe, and where it ties in with The Dark Tower, which was a much bigger letdown than this movie. But okay, let's talk about characters for a minute. The main set of characters are the losers. A set of friends who have been the outcasts and being beat upon. They're a little bit on the nerdy side, but they're not really nerds necessarily. At the end of the day, they're just the ones that didn't quite fit in right. And that's okay because they fit in with each other. One of the things I love about that, though, is that it would have been so easy to just have them become caricatures. In fact, that's one of the problems that people had with the miniseries. At the end of the day, though, each of these characters are their own character, and each one stands alone. Each one has their own arc. Well, 90% of them have an arc. And at the end of the day, I have to say that each one holds their own. The actors are doing well, the scripts are written well, and like I said before, there are scenes that literally took me back to my own childhood of 1989, so they were doing something right. Now, out of all of them, there are two of these characters that I want to call out specifically. First, Beverly. She is obviously the star of this movie. Let's face it, when the book was written, she was the token girl, and she had a very important part to play, one that I wasn't exactly happy with in the book, and we're not going to talk about. But she had a big role to play in a lot of what happened, in movie and in book, and at the end of the day, this actress pulled it off well. But there's a second one that I want to pull up, and that's the one that makes nerdy look interesting. Ben, having done most of the research and being one of the first ones to have answers, has to deal with a lot of exposition. He needs to explain what's going on and how it's going on, and as such is the librarian of this story. And he handles it well. He at no point feels like he's just an info dump. But now, the fact that I signaled those guys out in no means that any of the others weren't awesome. The all were really stand up. The only one that I'm not 100% sure on is Stan, and that's because of all of them, he's the only one that had a very minor arc. But of course, what would be heroes without villains? And before we get into Supernatural, we have the town bullies. A rival and slightly older set of kids that are pretty much a street gang for all intents and purposes, and the type of people you don't want to mess with. In fact, there are several clues throughout the story that they are going to grow up to be just sociopaths. Well, not everyone in Derry grows up, so there's that. And that's part of this too, all of the missing children. And at each stage, when we get a missing child, it feels. You get hit with the fact that something's wrong here, and they know it. And of course that leads to the final character, Pennywise. It needs to be scary, it needs to be in your face, but it needs to be smart and it needs to be playful. And this particular take on it, on Pennywise, is very well done. At no point is it too over the top, like I think Tim Curry's was a little bit. But at the same time, the special effects just... there are scenes that are going to make you want to crap your pants. But let's get into the plot in order to discuss that. For a story with so much going on, it's surprisingly linear. The story's pretty simple. Imagine if you grew up being the outcast. Now imagine you had no one to turn to for help. Imagine if everyone in town was against you. For most of us, the feeling, if not the facts, probably relate pretty easily to somewhere around the age of the beginning of teenage years. Now imagine that all these crappy things were because there was some sort of supernatural evil living within your town, a corruption from the beginning. And the plot is all about these kids and as they get confronted. But it's also the fact that part of the way you have to deal with Pennywise is you have to not be afraid of him. And all of these kids are messed up in the head. In fact, I can honestly say Pennywise is not the scariest monster in this movie. In fact, I'm going to just slightly dip here for a second and say, you could do a version of this story where everything Pennywise does is bullshit and hallucinations in the minds of these kids, and most of them have psychological damage enough from what they've been through, what they're going through, that you could believe that these kids kind of just lost it, and that it would just be a coming-of-age story with no supernatural enemy. But it's not that, because, well, Stephen King writes horror. So what comes next is getting hit by the clue by 4. If you can't tell whose point of view we follow for most of this movie, you're really not paying attention. We follow these guys, or maybe very specifically these two, because for the most part, Beverly and Bill do most of the heavy lifting when it comes to characterization. These two are the ones that have been hit the hardest by the psychological damage in the movie, and they're the two that come through in the end. We follow through their eyes, and then we get to theme and symbolism. Symbolism and theme. And let's touch again on what coming of age means, and the fact of what they said right in the trailer.
When you're a kid, you think the universe revolves around you. You think that you'll always be protected and cared for.
Because part of being a child is part of not needing to worry about part of not having to take responsibility just yet.
Then, one day, you realize that's not true.
There comes a moment when you put aside childish things and try to be an adult, when you take responsibility for your actions, when you have to stand your ground, when you have to be a person, when you have to be a man or woman of your word. And at that moment, you can't be afraid of the dark anymore. Well, maybe that's not true. Maybe everyone in Derry was really living in fear. Because that's what it is. It can become anything you fear. Of course, by the end of the movie, it learns that there's something called fight or flight response. And then there's Beverly. Beverly very symbolically cuts off her hair at one point. Beverly also very symbolically has to buy maxi pads or tampons, or I'm a guy, feminine things, in order to signify the fact that she's right on that cusp. She's going to become a woman, even though she's just a girl. But the hair cutting made me actually twitch a little. I'm going to do my best to keep this just general. But as long as the Beverly picture's up, I warn you, I'm going to be talking about some sexual stuff. Specifically the fact that her father was abusive. Now, they leave it rather up in the air in the movie, whether he's only been verbally abusive or if he's actually already been physically, sexually abusive to her. But either way, she is totally messed up in the head, and they showcase it over and over again. But her cutting her hair, because he touched her hair, is a showing of her trying to take away the femininity that he likes. Shape-shifting clowns have nothing on that. Nothing when it comes to horror. But okay, one other minor moment, also dealing with Beverly, I want to talk about. And it's one that really made my skin crawl personally. Right after one of the attacks of the bullies, the boys need to buy medical supplies, just a little bit to tape up some injuries, but they don't have the money. And this is when they first run into Beverly, and she distracts this pharmacist by kind of flirting with him. She says that those glasses make him look like Clark Kent and asks if she can try them. When she puts them on and asks what she looks like, his answer is, "You look like Lois Lane." Creepy. I don't know if I could pay a compliment to a young woman again for the next couple of weeks without thinking of that scene and wondering if, that's just, no, wrong. Bad wrong. But at the same time, it's the same sort of sexual exploitation that she puts up with throughout the movie. And then there's the room covered in blood, and, well, then we're back to feminine hygiene products, so I'll let you draw your own analysis of what that is. Alright, so overall, the movie itself was really good. The movie gave us everything I wanted. But here's where we get to the point where I really get to brass tacks. And we get to the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good, I'm just going to recap most of my review, so I'm going to try to keep it succinct. Good 80s nostalgia, a cast that's knocking it out of the park, a script that allows us to have individual characters that actually have their own arcs without getting in each other's way, and most importantly, honoring the source material. But at the same time, we have strong themes and a coming-of-age story that I don't think many people could duplicate. After all that praise, what could I possibly say was bad about this movie? Well, unfortunately, a couple of things. And we're going to start with the fact that if you already knew the book, if you already knew the miniseries, you already knew the ending. They did not surprise you that much, which in and of itself can be a good thing. Like I said, paid attention to source material. But it means that most of the scares come from jump scares. And I'm not a big fan of jump scares. Not just because I jump. But in general, I think that they could have paid a little more attention to the innate horror. Let the sequel sit in just a little bit more throughout all of this. And second of all, most of the human antagonists didn't get a lot of screen time to develop. Only one of them really got any time to understand why they were the way they were. And in a movie that did so well at explaining just how different each of our protagonists were, that felt missing. And finally, what can I say is The Ugly? And I'm going to do my best not to compare the movie to anything else that came before it, just on its own. The Ugly is the fact that it doesn't have a real ending. And yeah, I know, it flashes up chapter 1, and the coming of age part really is driven home. But part of me feels like there's something missing here. By the end of the movie, it felt super heroic and not super horrifying. Yes, I understand that part of this is that they overcame their fear of it, and that part of this is that they figured out its weakness was that they could all work together. And when they worked together, they were stronger than by themselves. In fact, specifically, Beverly called this out earlier in the film. But at the same time, they had him on the ropes so bad. Now I know over the next 27 years they're going to go their own separate ways and have to come back and fight it as adults. I know this because I know the story. But if I didn't know the story, there's part of me that feels like I would have felt a little gypped off there. But again, overall I liked it and gave it a solid gold. In fact, this was close to being a platinum story. And before I finish this off, I just want to dip into a little bit of my own storytelling theory. This was a rated R movie, but at the end of the day, its main theme, its real power, is the power of friendship. And that story can be told in any rating. So, the same way I say this all the time, I'm just going to point out, people laugh at the ridiculousness of Yu-Gi-Oh's friendship symbol, and the fact that they can hold strong together and believe in each other. But at the end of the day, that's what just defeated one of the scariest monsters I've ever seen. I'm sure next month when we're talking Halloween stories, I'll bring this up again. But for now, if you've liked this review, hit that thumbs up button and of course share it with your friends. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and enable alerts. I'm trying to build a community here, one where we can talk about all sorts of stories, including horrifying, scary ones like this. And I'd like for you to respond. Let me know what your thoughts were, so that we can build this community. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to try to get some sleep, although I don't know how I'm going to. He pounds his fist against the post and still insists he sees the ghost. He pounds the fist against the post, still insists he sees the ghost. Nope, not working, still scared shitless. I hope you have a good night, and thanks for watching.